Well, everybody, the Republicans are continuing their demonic crusade against the rights for people to control what happens to their bodies, that is, to have access to an abortion, or frankly, many forms of birth control that don't even, go that far. Things as far as Plan B, contraception, they're very much desiring to control the sex life of every single American. And it's very, very startling, to say the least. A little worried about that. And in light of that news, we've got a story coming out of Ohio that I figured we should cover. It's quite related to these Republicans' demonic ideals. Before I actually get into it, though, I feel like I need to give you some context, because I know many of you guys have never heard of Ohio. So for those that don't know what Ohio is a place where everything is weird. For example, if you try to play Minecraft in Ohio, it will go something like this. So yeah, pretty much that is the experience of living in Ohio, which is why, as you can imagine, when the Republicans try to go after the rights of Ohioans to have access to contraception, abortions, and what have you, it's really worrying, right? Now, when Republicans try to attack abortion rights, they typically go for one common strategy, and that is passing something that's been dubbed heartbeat bills. You see, the definition of a heartbeat is a little bit loose, right? Technically, the pulsing of tissue that will eventually form into the muscle that will eventually become the heart can be considered a heartbeat. And that is something that happens pretty early on in pregnancy. It even happens in unviable pregnancies fairly often, and you would be surprised at how many total pregnancies that happen every year are unviable. In fact, many, many women, at least those that are sexually active, have unviable pregnancies multiple times a year and just end up having a heavier than usual period because it just didn't stick. A surprising amount of fertilized eggs do not actually end up resulting in an embryo that proceeds to develop into a fetus. So, with that in mind, Republicans try to politicize this, and they try to point at this idea of a heartbeat. A heartbeat is, in many cultures and in many people's minds, a sign of life, a sign of a living being. And because of that, the Republicans say, the heartbeat, it's a baby, it has a heartbeat, it's alive. Now, I could break down the science of how what it is that is being detected is not actually a heartbeat, because the heart is a very, very complex organ in the human body, and for it to actually realistically be considered a heart, it would need to develop much further and for much longer. It doesn't matter. The Republicans have a lot of power in this country. Now, what one could argue is a detectable heartbeat tends to occur at around 6 weeks after fertilization of the egg, after conception, essentially. Sometimes it happens a bit sooner. Sometimes it happens a bit later. Every single, development of every single person goes a little bit different, and obviously development ends before it is supposed to many times, and you get a lot of unviable pregnancies, as I mentioned before. However, 6 weeks is what Republicans have pointed to as the reasonable moral cutoff. Now, to a lot of people, 6 weeks sounds like a lot. By a lot of people, I mean a lot of men. To a lot of men, 6 weeks sounds like a lot of time for a woman to figure out she's pregnant and to, seek out an abortion before the fetus has developed much further. Problem is, the vast majority of women who have gotten pregnant do not know that they are pregnant until after 6 weeks. The vast majority of women do not know until after 6 weeks. This statistic is extraordinarily common and very well known, is not challenged in the scientific or medical community, and is unanimously agreed upon in those spaces. The Republicans know this is true, and that is the intention. To politicize this idea of a heartbeat to lend credence to a law that on paper seems reasonable to the average person who's unfamiliar with the development cycle of an embryo, but to people who know what that kind of law entails is basically a guaranteed ban from access to an abortion. Now, obviously, you get all sorts of real smart-ass responses from conservatives like, oh, what, you need 6 weeks to know you got pregnant? If you had sex and things feel weird, then just go check. Or hell, go check anyway. Take a pregnancy test after every time you have sex. Pregnancy tests, of course, give plenty of false positives and false negatives, so it's hard to know whether or not that's going to be a reliable result. And of course, further testing can be invasive and expensive. So it's very much a class issue. And, you know, the American middle class has been pretty consistently shrinking. Most people don't have the money to afford an ultrasound after every, or a pee test after every time they have sex. Most people don't have that money, and Republicans know that. Which is why they try to pass these bills that on the surface seem very reasonable to people who aren't really in the know on the science behind this stuff. But trust me, these Republican politicians are very in the know on the science behind this stuff. They know exactly what time period is perfect to instill this ban to maximize the amount of women not being able to get an abortion in time. Now, of course, trans men and non-binary people can also get pregnant and also need access to abortions, but I think it's fair to say that in the case of the abortion issue, Republicans' main motivation is to control the bodies of women more so than to control the bodies of trans men and non-binary people. That's sort of not even an afterthought to them. It's more so just their primary objective is controlling the bodily autonomy of women, to remove their agency. It is, of course, evil. And they are evil. Let's read this article now. Ohio's Supreme Court to weigh abortion amendment's effect on heartbeat case. The Ohio Supreme Court is officially reopening its review of Ohio's 6-week heartbeat abortion ban in light of last week's passage of State Issue 1, the ballot issue that adds abortion rights to the state constitution. Let's go, Ohio! Chief Justice Sharon Kennedy, a Republican, issued an order Thursday giving a state attorney general Dave Yost and plaintiffs until December 7th to file written arguments stating what effect they think Issue 1 has on the case. December 7th is the same date that Issue 1 will go into effect after voters approved it in the November 7th election by a 57% to 43% margin. The development isn't surprising, but it illustrates the piecemeal manner through which the November 7th vote will actually go into effect, because Issue 1 changes Ohio's main governing document while not repealing any specific law. Any individual abortion law on the books would have to be the subject of a specific lawsuit challenging it. Then it will be up to courts, with the Ohio Supreme Court potentially having the final say to decide how Issue 1's passage affects the law. So, essentially, it is now a legally enshrined right in the state of Ohio. Thank you, Progressive Victory, by the way. That was one of the states that our friends over at Progressive Victory were fighting for. Ohio has now enshrined the right to access to an abortion in the constitution of the state, right? However, that does not instantly Thanos snap away every Republican abortion ban that has been passed in Ohio, okay? What it does is allows for a very, very powerful what's the term for it? Standard to be pointed to when suing for the right to access to an abortion if one of these laws that is currently in place prevents it. So, for example, there's a very similar situation that happened in the state of California recently in the realm of firearm rights. Obviously, we nationally have the Second Amendment enshrined in our Constitution, which means that there's a very strong argument to be made in a courtroom that every form of gun control or gun safety policy is anti-constitutional and is thus, subject to getting shot down by the Second Amendment. No pun intended. And that happened recently in California with magazine limits, I believe. California has the same magazine limit, or had the same magazine limit ban there as they have here in Washington. And someone went to a federal judge in California, a Republican federal judge, and tried to get his help to sue the sue the bill that bans magazines over 10 round capacity, and it worked. And I'm pretty sure it is now legal in California to have magazines over 10 round capacity. So essentially, in the state of Ohio, if somebody tries to get an abortion and they are turned away on the account of that law, they can sue and point to that article as the precedent set to have that particular law in court taken down, shot down, and repealed. It won't just instantly Thanos snap them all, but there is now an extremely powerful tool available to start meticulously cutting down those horrible Republican laws blocking people's access to abortion rights. The U.S. District Court of Southern Ohio issued a similar order last week in relation to a challenge in a 2015 state law that involves the written transfer agreements abortion clinics must get from nearby hospitals in case of an emergency. Abortion rights activists, meanwhile, have signaled they will challenge at least some of the 36 anti-abortion laws the General Assembly has passed in recent years, but have been circumspect about their specific plans. In the case of the fetal heartbeat law, there's already an open lawsuit filed by abortion providers challenging it that's before the Ohio Supreme Court. The court, where Republicans hold a 4-3 majority, heard oral arguments in September from state officials who were appealing a lower court's decision that kept the case on hold indefinitely. Republicans love that, by the way, just finding weird loopholes to keep any progress from being made in just the most shameless and obviously anti-democratic way possible. They don't care about it being obvious that they don't give a shit about democracy. They're publicly proud about being against democracy. State officials argue that the abortion providers who brought the case didn't have standing or legal eligibility to sue. If the court were to agree, it could dismiss the case entirely and put the law back into effect. In addition to the question of whether the clinics and doctors have standing, the state also is pushing the Ohio Supreme Court to force a faster resolution of the state's challenges to a Hamilton County judge's decision to put the law on hold. Technical legal questions aside, Yassis said Issue 1 would invalidate the heartbeat bill, per a legal analysis his office prepared for public consumption ahead of last week's vote. Abortion rights providers, meanwhile, have argued Ohio's constitution barred the heartbeat law even before Issue 1 passed, saying existing protections having to do with privacy and other rights in the state constitution extended to protecting the right to have an abortion. So this is very interesting because Ohio has been one of the states that the Republicans have been primarily targeting with their culture war or electoral and culture war fight against contraceptive and abortion rights. So this is a pretty big L for them and a pretty big W for not just the left, but for all Americans. I gotta say, I'm glad to see it. Of course, this doesn't really have the most direct bearing on contraception rights, but they are tied in hand. So if you want to help take part in a group that is fighting to keep Republicans out of power who desire to take away your right to access abortions, contraceptive, Plan B, even medical treatments that can be life-saving or life-improving because they're considered to be some form of birth control, then please consider checking out Progressive Victory. If you do !PV in the chat, Zanbot will post a link through which you can check out their website and volunteer. You don't even have to leave the house to volunteer with Progressive Victory. No matter how much of a shut-in internet neat you are, they will have something for you to do to fight against the Republicans and their very desperate goal of taking away your rights. So if you're as motivated to keep your rights as they are to take them away, consider checking out Progressive Victory.